Imagine walking into one of the most exclusive restaurants in Los Angeles, a place where the air is thick with expensive colognes, designer suits, and whispered conversations about stock portfolios and luxury vacations. At a corner table, a man sits alone. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, just a simple navy polo, a pair of khakis, and a quiet confidence that seems almost foreign in today's world of constant self-promotion. To most, he's invisible. Just another old man taking up space in a society that worships youth and novelty above wisdom and experience. And that's exactly how Brandon, the young, arrogant waiter, sees him. Brandon doesn't recognize him. He sees only what he wants to see, a nobody, an outdated relic in a world that belongs to the young, progressive, and important. What he doesn't know, the man he's about to humiliate is Clint Eastwood. And by the time the night is over, Brandon will learn a lesson about humility, respect, and what it truly means to be a man. The kind of lesson that used to be passed down from father to son before America started forgetting its roots. The Silverwood Steakhouse wasn't always like this. For nearly 5 decades, it stood as a monument to American excellence. Red leather booths worn smooth by generations of hard-working men and women. Wood paneling harvested from California redwoods back when craftsmanship meant something. A menu that hadn't changed since 1965 because perfection doesn't need updating. It used to be a place where men shook hands like they meant it, where families celebrated anniversaries, and where hard work and integrity mattered more than social status. Where a factory worker could sit next to a CEO and both would be treated with the same respect because character, not wealth, was the true measure of a man. But that was before it got modernized. The new management wanted a different crowd. Wealthy influencers, tech entrepreneurs, and social elites who valued image over authenticity. The kind of people who'd never worked with their hands a day in their lives, but had plenty of opinions about how the country should be run. They changed everything. The classic wood paneling, replaced with stark white walls covered in abstract art that looked like a child's finger painting. The comfortable booths, swapped for uncomfortable minimalist chairs that prioritize style over function. The menu was now full of trendy, overpriced dishes with tiny portions and foreign names no real working man would ever order. Oh, the dress code catered to those who cared more about appearances than substance. And the prices? Nearly tripled, ensuring that the very people who built this neighborhood could no longer afford to eat here. And the staff? They had been trained to value one thing above all else: exclusivity. To treat customers not based on their character, but on their clothes, their connections, and their capacity to post about the restaurant on social media. No one embraced this new culture more than Brandon. At 28, Brandon wasn't just a waiter. He considered himself a hospitality curator and a gatekeeper of luxury. With his carefully manicured beard, designer glasses with no prescription, and a vocabulary peppered with words like curated, artisanal, and sustainable, he embodied everything that had gone wrong with America's younger generation. He'd never changed a tire, never built anything with his hands, never served his country. But he had 50,000 followers on Instagram and strong opinions about pronouns. And when he noticed the old man in the corner, sipping on a house whiskey, dressed in average clothes, and taking his time at a prime table, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Brandon approached the table with a smug confidence that comes from never having faced real adversity. He barely looked at the man before speaking, voice dripping with politeness so fake it was almost insulting. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice you've been nursing that house whiskey for quite a while now." The older man, Clint Eastwood, looked up, meeting Brandon's gaze with the calm, unshakable presence of a man who had stared down far worse enemies. His eyes, weathered by decades under the California sun, held the quiet strength that defined men of his generation. Men who spoke with actions, not endless words. "It's a good whiskey," he replied simply, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who says what he means and means what he says. Brandon forced a thin, professional smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. "You see, sir, we have a number of VIP guests arriving soon, and this table," he gestured toward the pristine white tablecloth, "is typically reserved for those dining with us." The message was clear. You don't belong here. Move along. A few feet away, a busboy named Carlos overheard the exchange. Carlos had grown up in America after his parents legally immigrated from Mexico in the 1980s. His father had taught him to respect his elders, to work hard without complaint, and to judge people by their character, not their wallet. Every Sunday they'd watch old westerns together, Eastwood films being their favorite, learning about courage, standing your ground, and doing what's right even when it's hard. He tightened his grip on his tray, feeling his stomach twist with disgust at Brandon's behavior. He knew exactly who Clint Eastwood was, and he could see that Brandon had no idea what kind of trouble he was walking into. Clint took another slow sip of his whiskey, completely unfazed. He'd faced down gunslingers in westerns, Nazi soldiers in war films, and tough-talking punks as Dirty Harry. A condescending waiter wasn't about to rattle him. "I'm comfortable here," he said, the kind of simple statement men of his generation preferred. No unnecessary words, no emotional outbursts, just plain truth. But Brandon wasn't backing down. In his world, the customer wasn't always right, only the customer who fit his idea of what right looked like. He flicked his eyes toward the host stand, where a group of young executives in $1,000 suits waited impatiently. The men had soft hands and softer spines, their wealth inherited or made through manipulating markets rather than building anything of value. The women beside them were dressed in outfits that cost more than what most Americans made in a month, tapping away at their phones, documenting their lives rather than living them. He had already promised them this table. "Sir," he continued, voice tightening with impatience, "our executive chef prepares an exclusive menu. The prices, well, they reflect the caliber of our establishment." He emphasized the word prices with a subtle condescension that suggested Clint couldn't afford them. Carlos clenched his jaw as he wiped down a nearby table, pretending not to listen. This wasn't just bad service. This was disrespect, the kind that had become all too common in a country where tradition was mocked and the wisdom of elders dismissed as outdated. At a nearby table, an older couple, Jack and Martha Wilson, regulars for over 20 years, shifted uncomfortably. They'd been coming here since Jack returned from Vietnam, saving for months to celebrate their anniversaries at what used to be the finest steakhouse in town. They'd watched the place change, prices climbing as the quality of both food and service declined. Jack, a retired police officer who still stood ramrod straight despite his 75 years, started to speak, but Martha touched his arm. After 52 years of marriage, she knew when to let a situation play out. She had seen that look in Clint's eyes before, in the theater, on the silver screen, the quiet before the storm, the moment when the hero decides enough is enough. "I'm aware of the prices," Clint said at last, his voice calm and steady as a heartbeat. Brandon rolled his eyes, not even bothering to hide his disdain anymore. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a different kind of establishment. There's a Denny's about 3 miles east." He smiled thinly. "The senior menu starts at 4 p.m. The restaurant fell silent. Even the ambient music seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. If you like this story, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing stories. Clint set his glass down, slowly and deliberately, the way a gunslinger might set down his weapon before a duel. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. Not the latest model, just a practical tool without unnecessary bells and whistles. Every eye in the restaurant was on him as he made a single call. "Frank," he said, "bring me the ownership papers and the renovation plans." Carlos felt his heart pound against his ribs. This was it, the moment of truth that his father had always told him would come to those who disrespected their elders. Brandon's cocky expression faded, replaced by uncertainty. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt. "You see, Brandon," Clint continued, his voice carrying easily through the now silent restaurant, "I've been coming here every Friday for the past 6 months, sitting at the same table, ordering the same drink. Want to know why?" Brandon swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. "Because 6 months ago, I bought this restaurant." A collective gasp spread through the dining room. The Wilsons nodded knowingly. They'd suspected something was happening when they'd noticed Clint's regular appearances. Carlos let out a shaky breath, a smile spreading across his face. His father had always told him that in America, patience and hard work were eventually rewarded. That justice might be slow, but it was sure. Brandon? He stood frozen, face drained of color, looking like a man who just realized he'd been standing on thin ice all along. "I didn't buy it for prestige," Clint went on, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't buy it to impress anyone or to add another trophy to my collection. I bought it to preserve something real, a place where people are treated with respect, no matter what they wear or how much money they have." He gestured around the restaurant. "I've been watching, observing what this place has become. How the regular folks who kept this restaurant alive for decades, hard-working Americans who saved up to celebrate special occasions here, are now treated like they don't belong." Frank, the restaurant's longtime accountant, arrived moments later carrying a leather portfolio. A Vietnam veteran himself, he'd stayed with the restaurant through all its changes, quietly keeping the books while watching its soul slowly erode. Clint flipped through the documents casually before handing them to Brandon. "You made one big mistake tonight, son." Brandon stared at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. "You judged a man not by his character, but by his appearance. That might be how things work these days, but it's not how they're going to work in my restaurant." Jack Wilson stood up from his table, his military bearing evident despite his age. "Damn right," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "About time someone remembered what this country was built on." Several other diners, mostly older folks who remembered a different America, nodded in agreement. Brandon stood in shameful silence, the weight of his arrogance finally catching up to him. Clint turned to Carlos, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide his smile. "This young man here, he understood something you didn't. Every time I've come in, he's treated me with respect. Not because he recognized me, but because that's how he treats everyone. That's why I'm making him a waiter. We need more men like him." Carlos's eyes widened in disbelief. "Thank you, sir. My father will be so proud." "Your father raised you right," Clint nodded to Carlos. "That's something that never goes out of style." Clint turned back to Brandon, who was still standing there, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "As for you," he said, "you have a choice." Brandon shifted uncomfortably, aware that every eye in the restaurant was on him. "You can leave and take your self-importance somewhere else, or you can stay, learn what real service means, and earn back your place. Not because you're entitled to it, but because you're willing to work for it." Brandon looked around the restaurant, at the older couples who'd been coming here for decades, at Carlos, who'd worked twice as hard for half the recognition, at Frank, who stood tall with the quiet dignity of a man who'd served his country and never asked for special treatment. For the first time in years, Brandon saw beyond himself. He swallowed his pride. I want to stay, if you'll let me." Clint nodded once. Good choice. A man who can admit when he's wrong still has hope." The restaurant erupted in applause. Jack Wilson raised his glass in a toast. "To the Silverwood, the way it used to be, and the way it will be again." Because at the Silverwood Steakhouse, respect wasn't just a word. It was a way of life. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to the Silverwood. Clint wasted no time implementing his vision, or rather restoring the restaurant's original spirit. The first thing to go was the stark white walls, replaced once again with warm wood paneling. The uncomfortable modern chairs were swapped for the classic red leather booths that had served generations of diners. "We're bringing back the classics," Clint announced to the staff one morning. "The dishes people could pronounce, the portions that didn't leave you hungry, the prices that a working family could afford for a special occasion." Brandon watched these changes with new eyes. Under Carlos's guidance, he was learning what real service meant, not catering to egos, but honoring the dignity of every guest. One evening, as Brandon was polishing glasses behind the bar, Clint approached him. "You're doing better," he said simply. Brandon nodded. "Thank you, sir. I've been thinking a lot about what you said." "And what's that?" "About judging people by their character, not their appearance." Brandon hesitated. "My grandfather used to say something similar, but somewhere along the way I forgot." Clint studied him for a moment. "What did your grandfather do?" "He was a steelworker in Pittsburgh, 43 years at the same mill. Never missed a day." Brandon's voice carried a hint of pride that hadn't been there before. "He used to take me fishing when I was a kid. Always told me that a man's word was his bond." "Sounds like a man worth listening to," Clint said. "I stopped visiting him when I moved to L.A. Thought I was too sophisticated for his simple wisdom." Brandon shook his head. "I called him last week. We talked for 2 hours." Clint nodded, satisfied. Sometimes we need to remember where we came from to know where we're going. 6 months later, the Silverwood Steakhouse was transformed, not into something new, but back into what it had always been meant to be. The menu now featured classic American dishes alongside a few carefully selected modern options. The prices were reasonable. The atmosphere was welcoming to all who entered, whether they arrived in work boots or Italian loafers. On Friday evenings, Clint still came in for his whiskey, sitting at his usual corner table. But now he was often joined by Jack and Martha Wilson, by Carlos and his father, and occasionally by other veterans and longtime customers who would return to their favorite restaurant. Brandon had changed too. Gone were the designer glasses and pretentious vocabulary. He'd traded his skinny jeans for well-worn denim, and his condescending smile for a genuine one. One evening, an elderly couple entered the restaurant. The woman walked with a cane, her husband supporting her elbow. They weren't dressed fashionably. Their clothes were clean but dated, the kind of Sunday best that people of their generation kept for special occasions. Brandon approached them with a warm smile. "Welcome to the Silverwood. It's our honor to serve you tonight." The woman looked surprised. "We haven't been here in years. We heard it had changed." "It has, ma'am," Brandon replied. "It's gone back to what matters." He led them to a comfortable booth, not hidden in the back, but in a prime location with a view of the entire restaurant. From his corner table, Clint watched the interaction with approval. Carlos, now the head waiter, approached Clint's table. "Mr. Eastwood, my father wanted me to thank you. He says you've done more than save a restaurant. You've preserved a piece of America." Clint nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes that's what it takes. One place, one stand at a time." He looked around at the restaurant, at the families celebrating milestones, at the veterans sharing stories, at the young couples learning what quality meant, at Brandon treating the elderly couple like royalty. "This is what we were always supposed to be," he said quietly. "A place where your word matters more than your wallet, where respect is earned, not demanded. Where tradition isn't just tolerated, it's honored. Carlos smiled. My father says America hasn't forgotten these values. They're just waiting for someone to remind us. Your father's a wise man, Clint replied. 1 year to the day after the confrontation that changed everything, the Silverwood held a special celebration. The restaurant was packed with a diverse crowd, old and young, wealthy and working class, united by their appreciation for a place that valued substance over style. Brandon, now the restaurant manager, stood at the center of the room. A year ago, I thought I knew everything, he addressed the crowd. I judged people by their clothes, their status, their age. I'd forgotten the lessons my grandfather taught me. He looked at Clint, who nodded encouragingly. Mr. Eastwood taught me that real strength isn't about putting others down. It's about lifting them up. That respect isn't outdated, it's timeless. And that the values that built this country, hard work, integrity, and treating others with dignity, are still the values that make us great. The room erupted in applause. As the evening wound down, Clint found Brandon at the bar. You've come a long way, he said. Brandon nodded. I had a good teacher. Several, actually. He glanced at Carlos, who was helping an elderly veteran to his car. I've been thinking about what you said, about preserving what matters. I'm opening a second location in my hometown, going to name it after my grandfather. Clint smiled, a rare, genuine expression. He'd be proud. The thing is, Brandon continued, I used to think the past was something to escape. Now I realize it's something to honor. Outside, the California sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, the Silverwood hummed with conversation and laughter, a living monument to timeless values in a changing world. Because some things never go out of style. Real respect, hard work, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. In a world that seemed to be forgetting these truths, the Silverwood stood as a reminder. One restaurant, one stand, one victory for the America that used to be, and could be again. Remember when America valued hard work and respect? Share your memories of the good old days in the comments and subscribe for more great stories.